Hey Natural Health Family Chiropractic, this is Dr. Ryan Hartman bringing you video 2 in this series of inflammation, the common denominator of disease. In this video we'll be specifically talking about the immune system and its contributions to inflammation. So in the first video we did kind of some concepts and overview of the importance of this subject of inflammation and how it's affecting us as a country and as a society. And inflammation is really involved in the majority of disease processes. So if you need some background, go back to that video and check it out. Today in the immune system, we give you an overview of that so that you'll have a better understanding of autoimmune disease and neurodegenerative disease. And in the last video here, we'll talk about daily inflammation support, what you can be doing on a daily basis to keep your level of inflammation in the body low. Just a little review from the first video again, Dr. Sarah and Ballantyne and the paleo approach, just describing inflammation, and we'll see some of these cell types that are going to be involved in this process of inflammation, as well as the proteins that are going to help provide a first line of defense against infection and injury. The big picture view of what's going on here is that when we have any sort of tissue damage, we're going to have a chemical release and we're going to have immune cell activation, which is going to lead to the process of inflammation. In the first video we talked about the cardinal signs of inflammation. You see the results down here at the bottom: redness, swelling, heat, loss of pain, and loss of function. You can go back and review those in video 1, the importance of those, but now I'm going to give you the why behind why those happens. And that is because when this inflammatory process takes place, we get increased blood flow to the tissue that is damaged. We get fluid that then leaks into the tissue that promotes that swelling, and the increased blood flow is what gives us the redness. There's also going to be clotting, which is going to wall the area off so that it's going to be less susceptible to further injury and infection. And there's going to be a large migration of white blood cells coming to that area, coming in on that increased blood flow. And those white blood cells, as we'll talk about in a little bit more detail in a few slides, are really the active components of our immune system, circulating throughout the body constantly. So the immune system is a super complex system, and we are learning more and more about it every day. People will literally spend an entire career investigating just one small aspect of the immune system because it is so complex. There's so many different cells, proteins, and chemical messengers that are being identified that are the main players of keeping our body healthy with regards to the immune system. And we'll see just how far-reaching that is here on the next slide. There's also our barrier systems in our body. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about that at this point, just because, again, we could talk an hour just about barrier systems in your body. But just so you know, the main barrier systems that are considered part of our immune system would be our skin, they would be our digestive tract, our respiratory barrier, and then also our blood-brain barrier. Our barrier systems all help to keep what's outside out and keep what's inside in, and allows us to keep our own cells to ourselves and keep outside cells out. Because as you'll see here, the basic function of the immune system is to recognize self versus non-self. Our immune system is constantly monitoring what's going on in our body with regards to our cellular makeup. It recognizes what cells belong to us and what cells don't belong to us. And it does that through this big word here, major histocompatibility proteins. Essentially what this is, I kind of illustrate it here at the bottom as a little flag that essentially sticks off of each of our cells. It's made up of amino acids or protein fragments. And what it does is our immune cells, over here you see the blue cell, it's constantly going through our circulatory system and our lymph system and identifying, does this have a flag that I recognize? Does it have polypeptides, amino acids, proteins that I recognize? Versus a non-self cell, when it sees this characteristic protein sequence, it says this is a cell that does not belong here. It will attack it, as we'll see here the process in a few slides. So I say here, flag identifier. I'll give you another example here on the next page of puzzle pieces or specific amino acid sequences. So we can also think of it like this. Our immune cells they don't look like this, but this is just kind of a general conceptualization. If it matches what it sees here in this foreign antigen or the foreign cell, if it matches all the different 3 receptor sites here as I'm demonstrating in this model, it's going to attack that cell, it's going to eat it, and it's going to expose this antigen and tell all of its friends to come and attack any antigens or foreign cells that it sees that carry this same flag or marker. The other thing is that we can also think of it like this. There's different protein sequences. So just imagine this is represented by ABC, QX, XYZ. So if the immune component, all these different letters match the foreign antigen component, it's going to recognize that as something it's been exposed to before. It's going to attack it, and it's again going to call all its friends to join it in the attack and fight off any of the invaders or the abnormal cells that have developed. Okay, so just a couple pictorial representations of what the immune system is doing. The immune activators is any non-self type of cell. And you'll see some of these are actually our own cells. They've just been damaged in some way. So the first one here, invaders or infections, these would be our bacteria, virus, parasite, fungi, those types of things that can get into our body. Tissue damage is another thing that can take our self cells and break them, and it exposes all the internal contents, and the body recognizes this as damaged cells. So injury, surgery, we can have different types of radiation, we can have burns, there can be organ damage, and I put just a few examples here. Atherosclerosis or plaquing of the arteries, diabetes, cirrhosis, these are all examples of tissue damage where the body is going to start to try and heal those damaged cells by destroying them and walling them off, as we talked about in those inflammatory responses. Foreign compounds, things that maybe shouldn't always be sensed as foreign, like foods or environmental allergens. Some people react to these, not everybody, but it may mount an inflammatory response if our body is reactive. Or certain types of toxins, if they build to a certain level and our body reacts to them, the body will start to form an inflammatory response to it, just as it would an environmental allergen. Rapidly dividing cells in the body, this is essentially our cancers or neoplasms. These are going to be recognized as non-self cells, and the immune system will attack them. Cancer is a process constantly taking place in all of our bodies, and our immune system, if it's healthy and it's working optimally, should be able to attack these cells, destroy them, and keep cancerous growths at bay. Sick and senescent cells essentially is a way of saying that as cells get older and they die, the body has a way to essentially kill them off, and they get replaced by new cells. So sick and senescent cells are replaced by the immune system. And then molecular mimicry is something we'll talk about. This is an example of where our own self cells are attacked by our immune system because they look similar to something that we've been exposed to in the past. We'll talk about this more in the autoimmune video because it's a very prevalent theory as to why autoimmunity develops, is recognizing our own cells as invader cells. So I told you I'd talk a little bit about some of the different cell types, and again, there's a ton of information that you can learn about neutrophils, lymphocytes, monocytes, all these different immune cells that you see over here. The complement proteins and cytokines, again, there's textbook written just about complement proteins and cytokines. So I'm just going to give you, again, a very surfacey overview of what these things do. But all the different immune cells and proteins are involved in all the different functions that you see on the right side of this slide. That is, there's antigen recognition, antigen presentation, phagocytosis. Just kind of a little overview is a number of these cells are what we call phagocytes, or they're cells they essentially they'll go and they'll eat, they'll engulf a cell that's presenting an antigen that they recognize as a non-self cell. And so they will then take that antigen, they'll put that flag up on their surface and be like, guys, this is what we're on the lookout for, and it will essentially start the process of going through it and wiping out all of those cells. And again, some of the different cells you see named on the left are responsible in our body for that process to take place. Other cells and the different cytokines and complement proteins are responsible for things like attraction and recruitment. They're going to pull other immune cells into the area by different chemical messengers. Our B cells that you see over here underneath the lymphocytes, specific type of lymphocyte, the B cell is what's going to produce our antibodies. T cells are, there's a specific branch of them called cytotoxic T cells, and these are essentially toxic cells that they will engulf, phagocytize a cell and expose it to toxin and destroy it. We also have supportive T cells, we have regulatory and suppressive T cells, and these are really important for kind of calming the process of inflammation once the damage has been taken care of. When our regulatory T cells are not doing what they're supposed to do, that is one of the situations where we can get prolonged or chronic inflammation. And that's a really good segue into this next slide here, acute versus chronic inflammation. I hope you've seen from some of the examples here that it is completely normal for our bodies to go through a stage of acute responsive inflammation. This should only last days to weeks, though, depending on what the damage is. It should be short-lived, and as you see, that's physiologically normal. What is abnormal, though, is when this response lasts months, potentially even to years. I mentioned an example of that on the previous slide of if our T suppressor or regulatory cells are not doing what they're supposed to. We can have prolonged exposure to a specific component or compound, whether that's an allergy, a sensitivity, even a recurrent infection. If those things are just constantly bombarding our bodies, or a toxin that we've been exposed to that's risen to chronic levels, or if our liver can't clear the toxins the way they're supposed to and they're building up, that can lead to things like chronic inflammation. There can be underlying disease processes. I gave a couple of examples here, like diabetes or gout. Very commonly we see inflammation really perpetuates those diseases, meaning that the diabetes and the gout cause inflammation in the body, but then the inflammation makes the disease process even worse. And so it's just a sick downward cycle that takes place if the inflammation is not controlled and if the underlying disease process is not addressed. Last thing you see on here is if we have reactions to self-tissue, as we do in autoimmune disease. Again, this can cause reactions that are chronic and inflammation levels that just remain elevated. And again, we'll talk more about autoimmune disease in a coming up video. But just know that that reaction to self-tissue can lead to chronic inflammatory or immune activation leading to chronic inflammation. For a little more right brain learners, can take a look at a slide like this rather than taking all the information and crunching our brain. Kind of see all these different things I've talked about over here in this left-hand column that can lead to cell damage, leading to immune cell activation, leading to the release of these cytokine or chemical mediators and communicators, antibody production, complement proteins being activated, leading to inflammation. Again, here we see, and this is just kind of a good summary slide of everything we talked about here, in the acute phase of inflammation for days or weeks. Eventually it'll lead to resolution of that, and then our T regulatory cells should come in and start to calm the process down. But what happens when it's chronic, it doesn't go away. Those T regulatory cells don't come in and turn the process down, and inflammation becomes chronic and causes a whole host of problems and is aiding in multiple disease processes as well. So the big ideas of some things, the last slide, like I said, was a great summary slide, but I want you to know these three things from this video and just kind of reiterating. One, this is a very complex system. Multiple cells, proteins, and different molecules all communicating together in order to produce inflammatory responses that, two, in the short range, the short-lived responses are completely normal. If we have an invader, if we have an illness, if we have an injury. In our lives, we will be susceptible to all of these things taking place. But our bodies, if we keep them healthy, should be able to keep them at bay. And then the third thing I want you to take away from this, prolonged effects indicated in multiple chronic disease processes account for the majority of illnesses that we experience in this country. Like I said, if you need some review on that, go back to video 1 and you can see all the different disease processes that have been either attributed to inflammation or it is a very common portion of what's going on in the disease process, even if it's not the cause. So again, stick with me through the next couple videos here through autoimmunity and then neurodegeneration, and we'll finally get to the good stuff of what can we do to be keeping the body healthy with regards to this process of inflammation.